10 gig IDS. Anybody ever try to do this? Ooh, uh-oh. All right. First of all, what are we doing here? I'm going to focus on performance, so not necessarily outputs, the visualizations, integrations, or rules. Just trying to get our performance up above this old but theoretical 50 megabit per core limit. Anybody who's tried it probably knows, yes, you can jump past this, and in this talk we'll try and focus on the big knobs, simply because it's a stable talk, and like I said, get you started here because packet sniffing is fun. I give you excuses for doing wire sniffing, you know, who is it, Strand, and then we'll say, oh, the packet or the wire doesn't lie. That's an excuse. I love sniffing packets. I've always loved sniffing packets. I'll use any excuse to do so. And then also, you know, things you can get from this, obviously running a signature-based detection. Flow data can come out of Suricata pretty easily, so your DNS and your CERT info. So even if we're getting in the point where it's more TLS, and encrypted data, we can still extract value out of doing this. I'm also not going to cover the Bro versus Snort versus Suricata conversation or Linux and BSD. Why worry over a few missed packets? This I actually found surprising when I started doing this. I was watching Eric, I'm not going to try to say his name. He's one of the main devs for Suricata, and he was giving a presentation at NetDev. I was watching for the XDP part of it, and he took a PCAP, sabotaged it a little bit to try and get these results. And it was kind of surprising to see this 10% missed alerts on just 3%. So it does become a big deal quick. My observed drop rate was 9% with just 1.55% packet loss. Again, he mangled the PCAPs that he was running. For mine, I just destroyed the sensor and sent it well above capacity to force these drops. Get out the lab codes. Be scientific about this. Honestly, I should have made this slide before I even started. The whole scientific method, don't wing it. Be very measured in your approach. You'll make misassumptions very, very easily. A couple of years ago when I was first doing this, I thought, oh geez, jackpot, I found a couple settings, I play with these, I get awesome performance. All I was doing was relying on buffer to account for a packet burst. In a sustained environment, you quickly find out, no, you cannot rely on memory to save you. Buffers will fill, you will start dropping packets, and once you force yourself into this packet drop scenarios, you're really hurting your performance, and it's hard to recover from. Figure out what you want to measure and how. I did not use perf in this case just because I didn't want to get that into watching what the CPU was doing. But if you're going hardcore, definitely look into that. I focused on packet drops. Most of my stats will be in bandwidth rather than the more appropriate packets per second. And then the amount of alerts generated off the test, because ultimately that's truly what the deliverable is. You're trying to get alerts into a SIM so people can review it and take action. And then part of another mistake I made, which I'm trying to head you off on, is think about what you want to measure first so you don't have to retest, because that kind of sucks. And one of the things I failed to measure was memory consumption. So I could, at the end, I'm like, oh sweet, let's throw some memory utilizations and show you which settings really impact memory. And I did not have time to retest all that for you. Resources. This is probably the most critical slide for anyone who actually wants to pursue this. Start here, start good, especially, obviously you're going to have to do the Suricata documentation. Start there, that'll get you a good feel. Then go to that Saricata Extreme Performance and Tuning. There's 2 guides, 1 and 2. It consolidated a lot of the research that I had already done into one place. And they had better explanations for what I had found in other places. And the explanations were specific to what we're trying to do. One of the big mistakes I made here was with the C states on the processor. I disabled all the power saving stuff. They'll call that out. No, you actually want to keep power saving states available somewhat, because you'll as you need to take advantage of turbo mode on your cores. And if all of your cores are running hot, you won't actually be able to get the cores going in the turbo mode. So build a good theory for what you want to do first before you start spending money on a box. All right, so this slide I'll explain quickly. This is, actually, I don't know, can you read that command at the bottom, the ls topo? It's a topology view of your hardware. Especially around the big boxes are the CPUs, which is going to be your focal point. This will help you make decisions on where you want what processes to run. Obviously, these are 2 very, very small boxes. And then I pointed out where I'm using the Intel X529 capture cards here. Here, I'll jump to a bigger one. This is a much, much bigger box. This is actually, screenshot is cut off. There's no device. The small box is going down. Those are devices that are associated directly to that CPU. What's hanging off on the other side is just the rest of the CPU. And then here's another big boy. This one actually had a Miracom in it and ran quite well for us, which is surprising when you look at, when you're reading through the documentation, you will want to actually test the theories. One of the big contradictions I found was, Mick, quit it, was hyper-threading. There you get into an argument about whether or not you should use hyper-threading on in this application, because in theory they could fight with each other. But your results aren't consistent. This box loved it. Hyper-thread away, burn every core, and everything runs great. This box, no. Only run single core or a single thread on them. The performance was a remarkable impact on performance. So that's why, again, don't run with assumptions. Start testing these to your hardware and the settings themselves. Let me see. Oh, and I also tried on this one. A lot of times I'll increase the buffer sizes. This was one of the only ones where it actually hurt horribly increasing a PCAP buffer. Because it's a Miracom, instead of AF packet, it used PCAP. Increased the buffer size on this one, destroyed performance. So let's start building up what we'll do. Isolate your cores first. This is the primary box I used here was an 8-core box. Now, no, I did not get 10 gig on an 8-core box, but I wanted to prove that I could get a gigabit per core so that you could easily scale up. When you have access to those 2 larger boxes, you're easily reaching for a 10 core. And you'll see all the different settings in here. A lot of this is all called out in the documentation, especially on Saricata tuning god. But yes, that C state setting them to 3, I did that wrong. But the critical ones here are the isolate the CPU. You're telling the task scheduler, don't put anything else on those cores. So we'll leave core 0, that's normal stuff. You know, Linux, you're going to need your shell running. You have to leave 1 in that state. From there, surprisingly spend a lot of time here. Don't really pay attention. These are just settings that were randomly used. I can give you the full ones. How I was doing this, I had would set up or configure the driver based on, and just have a shell script, run all the commands for this configuration, run all the commands for that configuration. For my testing, I was primarily using AF packet and another setup using the extended Berkeley packet filters and XTP. They utilize the receive size scaling completely different. With AF packet, you want one processor processing all the interrupts from the card and let it bear that brunt while the other cores are working, processing the packets as they come in. For the XTP configuration, they want you to spread it out, get that workload distributed. And if you're going to go that XTP route, the two on the bottom are the bolded ones. That's going to actually enable the driver to do the interaction, or Sarah to interact with the driver in the method needed. And then the other thing is overriding the default hashing key. By default, Microsoft developed RSS for web servers, which is a completely different application. When it's with an IDS, you need the complete flow bidirectionally going to the same core. With a web server, you can spread that out. That will not help here. We need it bound to the same core, and that will help account for this. By default, RSS will break you. Next, look at what Sarah is built to do. This is less important today, but a few years ago, that critical go to jail stop was not in there in a lot of default packages. You really need to have hyperscan. That was the single biggest benefit you could get across the board. But hyperscan requires SSE3, which is an Intel command. Or was it microcode? I can't remember. I'm blanking out on the term. Instruction set. And then AMD came along in 2001, adding it. Again, I'm using AF packet for the Intel cards, PCAP for the Miracoms, and then my supposed saving grace for another issue we run into is the extended Berkeley packet filters and XTP. Now I get to find out who was paying attention to the last slide. I know everybody wants to know what you can do with a Pi. But anybody going to tell me why this ain't going to work? Winner, winner. Correct, the ARMs do not have the required instruction set. But I tried it anyhow with a brand new Pi 4 with 4 gigs. I had to move it. That was really warm. So I put the IR probe on it. That's 152 degrees on the surface of that board. So I quickly said, ooh, how do we check the internal temp? Yeah, we got 84 degrees. The Pi's max is 85 Celsius. So here's what happened pushing a gigabit to it. It would not receive a gigabit. It maxed when it was cold at 723. As the temp rose, the packets per second it would ingest started dropping considerably. The results were awful, and the Pi suffered little. So yeah, in a small workout breakout, this would work fine in your house. Like not pushing packets, yes, at home it works. But 100 meg watching your internet traffic. For real, no. Here's a lot of the critical settings inside of the Sarah config that I found the most beneficial. AF packets, we're running 8 core, so I went ahead with 7. Keep that in mind. These numbers were specific to my box. You take these numbers and change them, adjust them up and down. Some of these numbers I have here completely contradict the documentation, specifically that max pending packets, they want you to have it low. Some of them I've put it as high as possible. The detect profiles, that's very consistent going with 200 groups there. And then on the right side coming down. That's how you set up the the core isolation. And the XDP config, that's another thing to note here. The documentation does not match this, but this works. What's in the documentation doesn't. Another possible consideration we could do here would be using the just not extended Berkeley packet filters, but the regular Berkeley packet filters, and excluding traffic on the command line for Sierra Cata. It took me a while to get to the point where this would be beneficial because I was dropping packets earlier on. You could also do a pass roll in Sierra Cata to just make a match and jump, but you're hurting yourself because you want to get rid of the packets as early as possible. Now let's get to some results here. This may actually be the third box we did. The first one didn't have the SSE3 instruction set, which is how I found that out the hard way. This is the smallest box I had that was successful with the Hyperscan. This is a crappy Celeron box, and yeah, once we make a few small adjustments here, it starts doing it pretty well. And there you can call out the difference with having Hyperscan available. Having that not available to the engine, I'm dropping 33%. Enabling it, it goes to 0 at 1 gigabit. So that's why I'm giving you a full stop, get Hyperscan going. This is where I did most of the testing. I did it with a couple of different ways. Instead of doing live PCAPs or coming off the live wire, the problem with doing that, you'll start making assumptions based on your traffic flow. Different times of the day, you get different traffic. I was using PCAPs being pushed with TCP relay so I could get the same consistent push and use that to either throttle up, throttle down the traffic, and then also to keep my expected alerts consistent so I know how many alerts I'm dropping. Started off at 1 gigabit. Wait, hang on. Oh, I'm sorry. And I intentionally used one of the PCAPs was intentional to cause an issue. Your biggest problem with doing this is going to be an elephant flow. So getting a single flow that's over 500 megabit, that's what's going to hurt you. You turn these cranks, you will easily be able to handle 10 gig worth of traffic, except for that elephant flow. And that's what I was working in this 8-core box. I could not get it below 3.5%, but this was an older desktop. This was not a true server. The documentation will lead you astray with the Intel cards. They will say, don't use the drivers from Intel. It won't work. You have to use the Intel drivers. And then also, I ended up, let me go through these quick. So you can see with Hyperscan going on. And you also I cranked up the loops for my testing because I made a bad assumption early on. I was pushing the PCAPs, but I wasn't filling the buffers. So in production, you want to have buffers to safeguard from dropping packets. When you're testing, unless you want to really drag out how long you want to run your tests, you need to keep your buffers as low as reasonable. So yeah, I did a happy dance, pushed 6 gigabit. Yeah, didn't drop a packet, then realized, nope, everything was in the ring buffer. A few of these tests, I would stop, TCP relay would be done after 5 minutes of traffic, but Sierra Cata's still burning on 2 cores because it's playing catch-up processing with the ring buffers. That's cool if you want to just show off, but if you're going to sustain at 10 gig, you cannot rely on memory. Let me see. And then I eventually started dropping how many cores I was using in this configuration. I ended up using one worker, one completely idle, and I was still, and then, well, 6, I'm sorry, 1 for management, one idle, and 6 actual doing workers to give me the 1 gigabit per core, that worked fine. However, when I cut it to 5 cores actually working, I started dropping packets again. So even on this desktop quality hardware, I'm still processing 1 gigabit of traffic without drops. Now, the last part was the disappointing, the XDP versus non-XDP. XDP and eBPF is supposed to drop the flows even earlier. So you start watching the flow, you get to the normal signature depth. You're not going to have a match, so go ahead and just start dropping that flow, and and get it down. If you get the right card, you can do it in the firmware. Otherwise, you're doing it in the driver layer. I really thought this was going to be the silver bullet. Yay! At the end of the presentation, this will answer all our hopes and prayers. It did not. It actually performed worse unexpectedly. Yeah, with XDP, now statistically, from the alert standpoint, because of the PCAPs I used, the number of alerts generated was the same, but the flows that were being dropped were later in the PCAPs. But if you look at the actual drop rate of packets, I'm running over 4.5, which is getting too high. I need to hurry up. Miracom, if you're going to use a capture card, you must recompile the Miracoms against the sniffer library, for one. 2, don't follow the documentation. Snap this. This worked. What they lead you to do in the documentation to configure it does not. And then on a later Debian system with systemd, this is where I chose to put it in the libsystemd systems Saracata service file to get, basically you need to pass environmental variables into the process when it's starting up to configure it. And my data ring size, if you go by the documentation there, that's completely contradicts what the documentation says. Again, adjust these settings, test them for your hardware and your environment, because your traffic flows will make all the difference in the world. And you have an H-top screenshot there. That is, I think that was taken at 8 gigabit, so of live traffic. And yes, this is the one that does not like the hyper threading, but it's processing. No, I don't want any questions. Questions? Sorry for doing this as a stable talk. This really could have been full-length talk for every DerbyCon, but we ran out of DerbyCons before I got started. Come on, somebody's got to call me out on something here. There's a lot of room. Yes, Mick.
So, were you using any custom kernel compiles, like changing things like so forth?
Surprisingly, no. On you getting the kernel, the forward kernel tree, I found it not necessarily using the Debian straight up. You do an apt-get install Saracata even, and you can get a good ways up this tree. But make sure but if you do this a few Debian build or versions ago, no, absolutely not. Compile your kernel. You have to compile Saracata, because you won't have hyperscan. Anything else? I'm not saying that the kernel compile couldn't possibly. Yes, sir.
Did you primarily use data packet, or did you test any other?
I was using TCP relay to replay PCAPs for this. That was my primary, because like I said, I wanted it to be the same repeatable test. Otherwise, again, I made that mistake before by not really controlling the packet flow, and I made bad assumptions. One of the big bad assumptions you can make is, yay, everything works in the afternoon. Will it work in the morning when the users all log in? That actually did work out. It was fine. Where I got hurt was in the middle of the night. What happens in the middle of the night on a network? Guess what a backup counts as? That's where I started learning about these alleged elephant flows that are the bane of your existence.
Scans.
Yes, but you want to try and keep up with scans, especially because a lot of them seem to be short and sweet, but either way, I already got the stop sign, so if you want to keep talking, we will talk outside.